Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&As. Looks like I have questions across a bunch of different platforms, so let's just get started right away and jump right in. First up, over on Floatplane, the importer had a question. In the last episode, I talked about shielded RCA cables. How big of a deal is this for consumer-grade TVs with component video inputs? I use a DB15 to component for my Mister going to my generic component switcher, then a cheap Amazon 3-foot component cable to my CRT's inputs. How better would an expensive shielded cable make in terms of quality? Will it be night or day, or will this be the equivalent of an audiophile thing where only a few would notice the difference? That's a good question, but I do want to start out by clarifying one thing. Just because the cables you bought are cheap doesn't mean they're bad, especially when you're talking about stuff that's produced in large quantities and sold on Amazon. I would be much more cautious about a really cheap SCART cable because that's a specialty item, but something like component video cables are produced in huge quantities. So just because it's cheap doesn't mean it's bad. But in the situation that you just described, I would let your eyes make the decision. Are you playing on your consumer-grade TV and you see weird interference on the screen, checkerboard patterns, flickering, stuff that just shouldn't be there at all? Or if you're not sure, what happens if you plug things directly into that TV and skip the cheap switch and the cheap cable? And I would kind of go from there. And if you don't really know, if it doesn't really look good to you at all, then that main DB15 to component cable might be an issue, as was mine. That was the story I had been telling about how that's the one I replaced that made everything much better. And the only way to tell, unfortunately, was to cut the cable open. Now, of course, I'm not saying that everybody should go home and cut open their cables to see if they're shielded. I just mean that if you're having trouble and you can't figure it out and your cable seems like it's fine, it might not be. And once only, I had a situation where they were fully shielded console cables made by a reputable manufacturer. I plugged them in, and I'm getting a checkerboard pattern as if they were unshielded. Sent it back to the manufacturer, and they emailed me a while later and said they were probably broken at some point because one of the grounding connections was off inside the console end of it. So technically, with the grounding connection off, it was an unshielded cable, even though if I had cut the other end off, it would have looked like shielding. So, I don't want to scare everybody into thinking that you're going to have cables that are useless or you need to go to these crazy lengths. I'm just saying that in your situation and in pretty much anybody's situation, if you plug everything in and it looks cool, great. If you plug something in and you see some noticeable problems, interference, flickering, weird stuff on screen, it's worth looking into. And you might find that it has nothing to do with the cables. It might just be how that type of CRT looks. It might be a million things. It might be how that video game console always looked. That's certainly the case of things like the Sega Master System. The NTSC models that I've tested, even with an RGB bypass, always have interference. There's ways to get rid of the last bit of interference, but it's probably way more trouble than it's worth. So I just would keep all of that into consideration, but I think in that long rant I was able to answer your question, hopefully. Now over on Patreon, Roberto said they were thinking of picking up a Time Sleuth, and they want to know if anybody's working on supporting 1440p or other resolutions. Is it even possible with the current hardware? Also, to follow up to this, is there a database somewhere with others' measurements? So a couple of answers. I think a bunch of people are working on different types of lag testers. I don't know if specifically Dan and Christoph are planning on releasing another one. I think its current limits are limits of the hardware itself. So if you go to the Time Sleuth website and your resolution isn't supported, it probably won't be with that set of hardware. I know anything that does 4K 60 is going to be pretty expensive, so I don't know if anybody would be doing that now. I've heard of other testers out there, but they're expensive. There's some limitations to them. There's certainly the Raspberry Pi 4 based tester that I've been using, but there's been an issue with the actual Pi 4 code, nothing to do with the lag testing code, that's been causing problems at 60 hertz. So there's probably stuff in the works, and it's probably going to come out in a year or two, but I don't know any definites on any of that stuff. I am kind of curious, though, because there's always that debate of if you run your panel at its native resolution or native refresh rate, what are the differences in speed that you could read? Will it drop lag lower? Is it a negligible difference? So I'm certainly curious about that. But from a gamer's point of view, using a Time Sleuth on a 4K or I guess even an 8K TV, if you could afford one of those, is going to get you a reading that's close enough to determine, yeah, it's good enough for gaming, or holy crap, no, this is terrible. So, you might not get as accurate numbers that you want, but I don't think I've ever seen a huge difference. I don't think I've ever seen a 1080p TV, for example, where if you run it in 1080p, it's 2 frames of lag, but if you run it in 720p, it's 5 frames of lag or something like that. Of course, all in game mode. So I would just, if you're looking for a lag testing device, I would grab what's out there now. I was going to do a lag tester shootout, but there's a whole bunch of stuff that I kind of wanted to wait to fall into place first. Not hardware related. I just thought if I released other videos before that, it might really help people who are looking to get into this stuff. I guess that's the chicken and the egg problem I always have. Do I stop what I'm doing now to work on those videos? But what happens if I can't get the videos I'm working on out? What's the worst of the two? And is there a database somewhere? Yeah, I put a shared Google Doc that people could add to. I have that linked right on the website. Rtings.com also posts their ratings. And I think there's other stuff out there. This is definitely something that would be a good fit for the wiki, which who knows when we're eventually going to get around to doing that, because my schedule has gotten infinitely busier since I first wanted to do that. So a lot of things would have to change before we would pull the plug or flip the switch, not pull the plug and release that. But I would love a community-based guide for all of this stuff, and Wikipedia style, in that there's always people double checking other people's results and other people verifying it, and if you get different results, opening up a discussion as to why, because maybe that's relevant to a setting and things like that. So I'll try to stick on that as much as I can, but I do have to get a few other things out first before I could circle back around. Scanline City wanted to know if any sort of sync cleaner exists for arcade machines, something similar to what the HAS can do, but for full arcade machines. The more arcade machines and monitors they get, the more they realize how much they differ in terms of how they deal with sync, trying to figure out a good solution. That's a good question. I don't really know. I do know that I've had way less issues with sync on arcade monitors than I have with things like BVMs, because those can be super sensitive depending on a lot of different factors. Whereas the only issue I've ever run into with sync on an arcade monitor is voltage, making sure that enough voltage was going to it, otherwise it wouldn't read the sync and it would just be as if it wasn't plugged in at all. So any arcade heads out there, wouldn't mind helping and posting links if those do exist. And if not, I have been working with a few people on making kind of like an all-encompassing sync fixer for retro stuff. The project's taken a backseat a few times now because, respectfully to everybody, including myself, by the way, who really needs one of these, there are bigger problems that we're trying to solve, but it's always on the back burner, and it's always something that we circle back to every now and then to try to finish. There's just so many different things that can go wrong, and once again, no disrespect, I'd rather not have any product released at all than release something that could potentially cause harm in any reasonable scenario. Obviously, if you plug AC voltage into a DC device and plug that into your monitor, that's probably going to blow everything up, but that's not what I mean. I mean, if you use it as directed, it's got to be perfectly safe, and I think everybody that I work with pretty much agrees with that. So we'll look into it, maybe that same device, but with just a switch for arcade monitors, or probably a safer way to do that would be an extra thing that plugs in the output for arcade monitors. That way there's no chance of accidentally flipping a switch or anything. I think that might be a good thing, but I'm interested to see people's responses and to hear if anybody already has something specifically designed for arcade machines that does work. Our Old Games is having a problem connecting an MSX computer to a Sony CRT. I'm not exactly sure what the total setup is, so I'll try my best to point you in the right direction, but basically the MSX into the VGA port of the open source scan converter works fine through the OSSC's HDMI output. So right off the bat, they know their MSX is working and they know their OSSC is working, but they can't get it to work through the CRT. So I definitely need to know what kind of CRT that is. Is that a VGA monitor? Is it a consumer grade CRT with component video inputs? Is it an RGB monitor? You say Sony Vega, so I think it would be a consumer grade TV with component video inputs. And if that's the case, what signal is your MSX outputting, and would that original signal, especially the frequency, the resolution, and all that stuff, be compatible with that? So you need to match 15 kilohertz or 31 kilohertz up to the monitor. If you're converting to component video, that should work, but you need to make sure that you're using the right adapters. So I guess if you could give me the exact model MSX just to make sure, and the exact model CRT, I would be able to look that up and give you a better answer. But without that, I would just be guessing as to what inputs and what monitor that you're using. So sorry about that, but hopefully we could follow up next week and I can get you all solved. DW623 has a random curious question. They have a flat panel Samsung LCD that was built in 2009. When they plug in their PlayStation 2, GameCube, Xbox, or Dreamcast into it with composite video, it looks like crap. When they plug them in with component video or VGA, they look really good. And they usually enjoy those consoles in that way despite the input lag that they notice but doesn't bother them. However, their Wii looks pretty close to the same thing whether they use component or composite, and doesn't have that huge difference the other consoles have. They remember using Wii consoles on even bigger flat panels before with just plain composite cables, and it never looked bad on those displays either. I definitely prefer playing the Wii U backwards compatibility for playing Wii games nowadays, but how is it not putting out such a decent picture with that higher quality signal? So the first thing I would test, without a doubt, is go into the Wii settings and make sure that it's set to 480p and 16:9 or 4:3. I'm assuming that's going to be a widescreen TV, so 16:9 widescreen and 480p, because you might not know, but you can't, or the Wii doesn't auto-detect that resolution. And in fact, there are many cases in which you would want component video and 15 kilohertz for things like Virtual Console and 240p, emulation, and that stuff. So that's my first and strongest guess, is maybe you just didn't realize that the original Wii doesn't have an auto sense or anything like that. If you definitely set it to 480p and you are using component video cables, there's also a chance that you bought cheap, unshielded component cables. And if that's the case, easy. Just pick up a set of HD RetroVision Wii cables and that would solve the problem. And I tested that here myself a million times on everything from junk $5 component cables for the Wii all the way up to brands that were supposed to be good. And the original ones, the HD RetroVisions, and I think the Monster ones all tested okay, but the HD RetroVisions are brand new, reasonably priced, and you can get them right from Amazon or Castlemania. So those are definitely the things I would check. Make sure it's set to 480p, and make sure that you're using good shielded component video cables. Photosfane wants to know what makes the Nintendo 64 so difficult to emulate. As far as they understood it, there's no 100% functional N64 emulator out there, but there are emulators for Wii and even the Switch. Has it something to do with the underlying architecture? So this is definitely a better question for somebody like Modern Vintage Gamer, and if you want to check out his videos on the N64, he does go into a bit of detail of exactly why that's the case. But overall, I think the best way to explain it simply, without making myself sound like a total idiot, is the chips on there. There aren't detailed information on all of them. So if you have a console like the Atari 2600, where every single chip on there is something that you could have always just bought, and there's documentation on all of them, there's been reverse engineering efforts, original documents have been found, schematics and stuff, you could recreate that pretty easily. Whereas if you have any electronic component, especially the more advanced ones as the years went by, without original info or without decapping and reverse engineering, it's really hard to emulate it because you're kind of guessing as how it works. You don't fully know. So if there are any FPGA projects for the N64 that successfully reverse engineer it, that would automatically make software emulation writers, or it would give them an easier time to create software emulators. But as far as I know, nothing like that exists out there. Maybe, I'm sure people are working on it, but nothing's out there yet. So I think the shortest answer to that is just because of the amount of documentation and accurate reverse engineering versus other consoles that are out there that use more off-the-shelf parts where there's other documentation on how exactly to do it. But I would definitely default to the experts on that one. Just consider my answer more of like a generalization than a real answer. DK Devil says they've been going through and picking up a lot of old consoles to mess around and play with, and they recently got into some systems from the 6th and 7th generations, notably the PS2, Xbox, and Wii. While they know there are great HDMI upscaler mods coming in the future, what would be the cheapest way to get a decent image on their flat panel out of these systems while they wait? Composite hasn't been a great experience. So totally easy answer for this one. For all three of those, as long as you could set them to 480p mode, which is super easy on everything except the PS2, all you would really need is a good set of component video cables, not the junk bin ones, but grab a set of HD Retrovisions for PS2 and Wii, and you could even get that Xbox to Wii adapter from Consoles for You to use the HD Retrovision to Wii cables on the original Xbox. Set the consoles to 480p, and just get a cheap component to HDMI converter. One of the ones that I link on my Amazon page that don't do any scaling at all. All you want is something that takes component and turns it into HDMI. You'll get a zero lag conversion and most likely a lower lag solution on your flat panel than going in through analog, and they'll look absolutely great. The Xbox supports some 720p games, which in my opinion feel right at home on a flat panel, and the rest of the Xbox library, except for a small handful of games, are 480p compatible. Same thing with the Wii. The majority of the library is 480p compatible. The PS2 is the only iffy thing here. And if that's your favorite console, then you have something else to think about. Most of the PS2's library is 480i only. So you would need to do something to convert that. Now, you could use something like the GSM soft mod to force certain games to run in 480p or higher, and that's hit or miss. I've had some games that even on the compatibility list say they're compatible. I can never quite get them forced correctly. Even things like widescreen mods, I can get them running in 480p, but they don't look right in widescreen, only in 4:3, stuff like that. If you wanted one solution available right now for all of those, I would get the RetroRGB multi-format, because it would deinterlace the PlayStation 2, pass through all of the 480p signals in an oversampling mode, that would take a long time to describe. So let's just say it's probably the same or better than that generic converter I talked about. And you could use it for other things too. You know, if you have a VCR that you want to run through your TV and stuff like that. There's other solutions and scalers coming out, some of which have already been teased quite a bit on forums and on Twitters. It's still, in my opinion, not up to me to discuss until they're officially released. But if you want to wait a little while longer, there should be better solutions coming out that would scale 480p as well. And of course, you could always pick up something like the DVDO iScan VP50 and VP50 Pro. You have to find them used, and they can get expensive, certainly more expensive than any of the scalers that I was referring to, but they could also scale HDMI, which would mean if you do any internal HDMI mods for any of these consoles, you could go into this and then scale that to 1080p, and it would look great. And the DVDO iScans also do really good deinterlacing, both for games and for movies and stuff. So it would be my personal opinion that if you think that you're going to also be scaling movies through this and HDMI consoles and want something right now, hunt down the DVDO. If not, and you want something right now, grab the RetroRGB. And if it's good enough for now and you don't mind waiting, maybe pick up any of the new scalers when they come out this year. But regardless of which, you're going to want good component video cables or an internal HDMI mod, which are far more expensive than all of that. So, and while I love them, it's not for everybody. So at the very least, I would probably start by grabbing some component video cables and go from there, because it's something that you could use on many different solutions, and they're all reasonably priced. You're not going to break the bank buying them. Corey Marsh would like a recommendation for a good consumer-grade CRT for use with gaming. And this is a question I've answered in detail before, but I think it's worth going over again, both for newcomers and to just refresh people's memories. Although at some point I would probably love to be able to go back and take my best clips from these Q&As and separate them into different videos that I could post. But anyway, to actually answer your question, you have to kind of divide these consumer grade CRTs in a few different categories. And the first would be what signal they accept. So any pre-HD CRT could only accept 240p and 480i. And all consoles throughout the 90s, with a very few exceptions, but mostly just the Dreamcast, we'll come back to that, but pretty much every console out there is either only 240p or 240p and 480i. So if that's the case, if those are the consoles that you're looking to use, 90s or before, then any original CRT that's not HD supported would be a perfect one to use. From that point, the only other question would be, what inputs do you want, and do you play light gun games? So if you play light gun games, you're going to want one with a curved glass tube, not a flat glass in front of it, because some models of the flat glass CRTs mess with light guns, and I would actually think most do. So I would kind of just approach it from that. But it just so happens that the later model TVs that have the higher quality inputs, like component video, do have flat glass. So you have to decide on a trade-off between quality or, light gun support. But also remember that a lot of these consoles could arguably look better in composite video. And I think some really good examples of that are consoles like the PlayStation 1 with games like Silent Hill, or any of the games that really rely heavily on the dither blending in order to create that look. Whereas other consoles like Genesis and Super Nintendo, I really think look amazing in RGB or component video in this case. If you're in North America, it would be component video. And that might be more worth it to you, depending. But I've always said, and I've really meant, that any input on a CRT is a good choice. The only exception is if you live in the middle of a big city, you're going to get a lot of interference over RF. But anybody that's seen any of the presentations I've done at the expos, I've demoed RF that looked identical to composite, but we were kind of farther out away from the cities and big concrete buildings where, you don't get a lot of wireless interference. So my whole stance on that would be, if you're looking to play games from the 90s or earlier, except the Dreamcast and maybe a few other exceptions, any CRT is good. At that point, just choose flat glass or curved based on light guns or not. And if you would like higher quality inputs, when you're talking about consumer grade CRTs, going from composite to S-video is a much bigger jump than S-video to component video. So that's just stuff to keep in mind. Now, HD CRTs. That's where stuff gets a little weird. Almost every single one, if not every single one that I've tested, treats 240p wrong. It treats it as if it were 480i. So playing consoles like the Genesis or the Super Nintendo or the NES that are pretty much all 240p, that's not going to look right. You're going to get that same weird deinterlacing flicker that you would see if you plug your consoles directly into most flat panels or into those terrible scalers, and it's not going to be a good experience. On top of that, some of these HD CRTs add lag because they're very simply just using the exact same scaler boards that were used in early model flat panels. I found models that do both. The lag, I don't think it's ever really over 2 frames, but it's still not something that I think would really, the total experience wouldn't fit well with older consoles. But if you have a PlayStation 2, now you have a really awesome choice. Because if it's one that accepts the signals directly, most of the PlayStation 2 library is 480i and 480p, so they'll look totally fine. Even if you have one of those XBRs that scales everything to 1080i, if you're going from 480i to 1080i, that's still a pretty cool look. So that's going to be worth it. Also, stuff like the Wii, the original Xbox, the Dreamcast, those early consoles in the HD era that can do progressive scan but were released at a time where people were still using CRTs, that would be a good choice. You might get a little bit more lag, but I do know a few people that their favorite consoles are PlayStation 2, original Xbox, GameCube, and they're able to connect those to these HD CRTs and get a really awesome experience. So I see you mentioned somebody saying something, the Vega branding signifies lag or something like that. And one doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the other, because you could get flat glass Sony Vega TVs with component video inputs that don't accept 480p. They're 15 kilohertz only, that have zero lag, process 240p properly. I think anybody that would generalize it that way, doesn't quite know what they're talking about. Respectfully, I mean, I'm just being honest. However, you did mention something like the JVC D series. Those are excellent. I own one with another one coming. They accept all inputs, including component video, which means you could do something like connect your PlayStation through composite, connect your maybe your PlayStation 2 through component video, or use SCART to component converters like the RetroTink ones. So there's really good choices. I have a few of these all in storage, and if someday I'm ever able to make it out of the city, I would love a basement where I could set up tables with examples of all of this, both to do videos and to kind of have people over to explain the differences between each. I think it would be a pretty fun thing to do. There's no way I could do that where I'm at now, so all of the stuff's rotting away in storage. So hopefully I'll get to the burbs at some point this year and be able to set this stuff up, but that's a whole other nightmare in itself. But I think that's a good direction to point you in. If you're talking about 15 kilohertz, so 240p or 480i, any CRT is awesome. Just make your choices based on flat or curved glass. And if you would like the sharper inputs, which I do appreciate, but I wouldn't consider them necessary, I would not use any HD CRTs on those older consoles, but I do really appreciate them, especially for the PlayStation 2, but also for Wii, GameCube, Dreamcast, Xbox, and depending on what else you're doing, a PlayStation 3 with a Blu-ray player so you could watch old movies in 480p, but on a CRT, so you don't really see a lot of the film noise that you might see on a flat panel. So they're all good choices. They all just, they each really have their own purpose. Couple of questions from Schwink. First, does the Behar Brothers Shogun MVS Supergun compare well to the Open MVS? I don't know. I don't think I've really done a deep dive, but I think, in my opinion, that should be a question that's answered on total setup and your goals and less on video quality. Because the Open MVS legit is excellent video quality. And I'm not saying that because I'm friends with the team members and worked with them on it. I'm saying that because of how much effort went into making sure that looked good and all of the proof through all of the captures that I took. But the Open MVS is also designed for having something that looks like an AES, but a small MVS motherboard in there. And if that's your goal, no disrespect whatsoever to the Behar brothers, but that's a Supergun plugged into an arcade board. That's really designed for people that have already owned a Neo Geo arcade board and just want a solution designed for Neo Geo that they could use. So while I'm not sure the exact answer to that question, I would let your total setup decide that for you. The next question, when you turn on your N64, the screen is now green at boot up, then goes to normal when the game starts. Is there a fix for this? I would need more info. Are you talking plugged directly into a CRT? If so, have you tried different output cables? Or if you have you tried a different CRT? Are you going through some kind of scaler? Are you going through one of those garbage, console-specific HDMI cables that are actually using the TV chips? It's okay if you are. I totally get it. Some people start out on a budget and then knowing that it's garbage and they need to eventually step up to something else. No disrespect for that at all. But if you are using one of those cables, I would be the first thing I would throw out and try for another one. So you'd have to give me more info. Otherwise, there's no way I'd be able to troubleshoot because there's just way too many factors. So sorry about that, but hopefully I could follow up next week. A few things from Focus. First, their new CRT they picked up is having an issue with audio, where shortly after turning it on, depending on the volume level, there's a loud pop on the speakers, followed by no audio afterwards. Just based on the behavior, the first thought is a bad capacitor somewhere along the line. That could be a whole bunch of different things. I've never run into that. I have the exact same JVC D-Series 32-inch that you're talking about, and my audio always worked fine. Capacitors are always a possibility with stuff like that, but it could also be a short somewhere. I don't think it would be a bad speaker just by itself because you would probably hear a crackling the whole time. It wouldn't go off. So yeah, that's something I would look into. I I don't really have any resources on where to go to look up stuff like that other than, really just doing it yourself, taking the back off, discharging the tube, which of course is super dangerous. I know people get annoyed when I repeat myself with this, but I gotta say, if you've never worked on a CRT before, you need to know that there is a severe chance of injury if you don't know what you're doing. Whereas normal mods with consoles, unless you leave the console plugged in and, do it with wet hands or something, you're pretty much fine as far as physical safety. But if you pop the back off, discharge the tube, and take a look, check out the main board looking for leaking capacitors, replace all the ones around the audio amp area and see if that fixes it. I did the cap replacement on mine, and it wasn't too bad. It was kind of like a 2-weekend project. I spent one day, actually I did a live stream with Danielle, which was probably the most boring live stream I've ever done. Not because of her, but because it was a lot of silence on my end. Like, hold on a minute, let me see, I can't see this capacitor. Wait, let me turn my head around. So it wasn't something that I would share, but it's basically just a video of me poking around with a flashlight trying to read capacitor values. And then I ordered all the caps, and then the next weekend I actually desoldered and replaced each one of them individually. And I never had problems before or after, to be honest. It did look better afterwards, but it wasn't like a holy crap moment. It just, I took the before and after pictures, and it definitely was an improvement. But that might fix it, and it's not going to harm. I mean, if as long as you do the cap replacement right, there's no harm done. So even if it didn't actually need it, now you've still just bought many more years of lifespan onto that board, assuming the CRT lasts, which it should. But yeah, I would check into a lot of different things. It could be a short, it could be wires that are, fell into a place they shouldn't be. There's really a long list of stuff that I don't feel too comfortable speculating on, because you would have to kind of go through step by step. Also, you mentioned you have a power kill switch that you added to the end of your retro setup that turns the power off automatically each day. That's pretty cool. Could you post the model that you used? Because I'd like to look into that. I don't know if that's something I would be able to integrate into my setup now, but it's definitely something that I know a few friends might want to know or want to integrate and would at least want to know more about. So that'd be kind of cool to look into. A couple of questions from Mark Main. I had to read this one a couple of times, and I think I understand the question, but I'm so sorry to tease you, Mark, but I appreciate your support. I'm definitely going to answer your question, but I just want to let you know that key up here next to the M, kind of above the control, that's called a period. So if you wouldn't mind using that or punctuation of any kind, I'd be able to answer your question a little clearer. Sorry to tease you. It took me forever to get your actual question. But I think I got it now. I think you're trying to take an unmodified NES N64 and Atari 2600 and integrate it in your setup. And your setup consists of a few different switches that get split between a composite or S-video only Sony PVM and a RetroRGB, the multi-format. So there's two parts to this. First, your 2600, the cheapest and easiest way to do this with an unmodified 2600 is to go and pick up any old VCR. Even if you find one with the broken with the tape still stuck in it, as long as it powers on, that's all you would need. Put the RF input into the VCR, then use the VCR's composite and RCA audio outputs to now convert that to composite video. And it's kind of big, but set the 2600 on top of it. Maybe you could integrate it in your setup and make it look cool, but that's the easiest way to convert that signal. There's other ways to do it, but they're more expensive, and it's about the same quality anyway. I would then just route that through the G-Comp switch if you have enough room, and then use the NES and the N64's composite video output. And if you're going through the RetroRGB, that's normally not the device I would suggest for converting things to HDMI, because it is a softer scale. However, when you're talking composite video, there's so much composite interference on there, but the 3-comb filter is so good on the M that it is a decent enough trade-off. The N64 will look fine either way, so I'm really just talking about the 2600 and the NES. So I think that'll be a perfectly good solution, and you could still run all of those signals right through your PVM as well. So I think that's the answer. If you really somehow needed to get it through the G-SCART switch, there's other things you could do, but it's really going to complicate things. You might need to make a custom cable or find weird adapters or anything. And if that's really important to you, I absolutely can walk you through how to do it. But I just think using composite and then using the GComp switch's composite video input would be the easiest way to go about doing those. And if I'm reading your setup correctly, it should still have that same ability to go out to both the CRT and your flat panel. And for anybody listening that's unaware, I'm talking about Mark's specific setup layout. There's no reason why you couldn't split any of these signals to 2. I was just trying to follow the signal chain in order to get through it. So hopefully there's no hard feelings for the tease, Mark. I was just having a giggle at that one, and I think I got you at least pointed in the right direction for your answer. Let me know if you need me to clarify. Allie Matthews recently picked up a cheap Super Famicom, and unfortunately, it's a non-1-chip revision, meaning it's the older revisions, sometimes referred to as 2-chip or 3-chip, that have a much blurrier output than the later model Super Nintendo and Super Famicoms. And they were wondering if there's some kind of RGB bypass mod or upgrade they could do to it. My strong advice for this would be wait for a little while longer, because there are stuff out there now, but there is a mod coming up that should have the potential to be exactly what you're looking for. Now, there's still some questions. The reason there are still questions are not because of the developer that found it. It's just because with everything going on in the world, there was a bunch of people who were going to work on this project together, and stuff got lost in the mail. People got busy by the time it did show up. Really nothing to do with anything other than bad luck. But that's all starting to come around now, and people are starting to take a look at it and verify important things like we've, as far as I know, only tested it on one motherboard revision. So will it work on all or only that one? Or, are there any negative repercussions? Because at the moment, it looks like exactly what you and a lot of other people were hoping for, a really cool bypass for those older models that gets the same, if not very close to the same output as the later Model 1 chip. So that's what I would wait for. And, just some perspective, if you're stuck with a slightly blurrier version for a few months and then upgrade it, that, in my opinion, would very often add to the whole, wow, look at how big of an upgrade this is, rather than just jumping right into getting the best version. I do want to address the other ones, though, because I'm sure there's going to be 100 actuallys in the comments if I don't. There's a way to bypass all of the revisions and put a different video amplifier chip in there, but it doesn't solve the blurry problem. So some things might look a little sharper, but interference might sharpen up as well. So I think it really does more harm than good. There's also another mod that sometimes sort of works, that it depends on the game you're playing. It depends on a lot of things, on what it ends up actually looking like. And if you're somebody that really enjoys modding and tinkering with consoles and trying new hardware stuff, I would give it a try, but I would also do it with the mindset of, hey, here's a fun electronics project that I will soon be uninstalling and replacing with the right one. So, and of course, no disrespect to anybody who's working on that other project. It's anytime you do something like that, it's always a learning experience that everybody benefits from. So I'm certainly not trying to throw shade at people working on the other one. I'm just saying that as far as the general recommendation goes of how to upgrade your console, that's not the one I would recommend. So the short answer, just wait a few more months. There probably is going to be something out there that'll work. And if there isn't, at least there'll be a lot more clearer information as to why and if there will be another choice in the future. Kayak has a question about using the Sega Genesis RAD2X cables, and I'm just going to skip to the answer and not read through the whole question, not because there's anything wrong with your question, but because there's some terms in there that get confusing, and I might even say the wrong term myself and then just confuse things even more. But to answer your question, there's actually 2 parts to the answer. As a user, as somebody with a completely original Unmodified or a properly modded Sega Genesis console, any of the models that have the Genesis 2 port on it, you don't have to worry about anything at all. You buy the RAD2X, you plug it in, and you're done. Nothing to worry about, period. The RAD2X is designed to handle whichever sync signal that it pulls. It's designed for the exact RGB levels. So as long as you're using either a stock or properly modded Genesis console, there's no problems whatsoever. Just plug it right in. I wanted to get that out of the way first because I'll talk a little bit more in a second about why that is. I just wanted people to know that unlike RGB SCART cables, there aren't sync choices. That you just buy what they are and they work perfect. And it's like the HD RetroVision cables, same way. There aren't many versions. There's just one that works on all. Now, the reason for this is because they're designed to take the exact signal that's outputted from those DINs. And the other side of things are, if you're a modder or if you're using modded consoles, you want to make sure that you're getting the right signals from them. And you said you want to buy one for testing different sources. So that's kind of where the second part of the conversation comes up, but only from the modding point of view. And that's if you have any device that has a Genesis 2 port on it, make sure it's a reputable device or it's a modded console that's been modded properly. So some examples of that. The Spark Plug, the device that plugs into the back of PC Engine and TurboGrafx, that has a Genesis 2 port on it. All of the pins output exactly like a Genesis 2. You can get composite video from composite, sync output sync just like a Genesis 2. Alternatively, the OpenMVS does not output composite video, but the voltage levels are the same on the composite video pin as you would find on a Genesis 2. Same thing with the sync. The sync levels are the same on the sync pin as a Genesis 2, which is why it's perfectly safe to use the RAD2X or the HD RetroVision cables or any properly designed SCART cable on the OpenMVS. And there's a bunch of other different mods like that. There are Superguns that are also modded the same way so that the output's proper. There's probably a million other devices that I'm just forgetting off the top of my head right now. But, I could probably go on a whole long rant about why you need to mod them this way and the dangers of it and why people have done it the wrong way in the past. But the bottom line is, anytime you have something that has a Genesis 2 port on it, you might know what it is. You might be able to customize it to your setup, but at some point, somebody else is going to get that, or you're going to lose the custom cable or whatever. And if that's the case, you're going to want to be able to plug anything in there that fits. So, obviously, we're talking in the context of retro gaming here, but if you're doing mods and you're working on these things and you're building mod boards, if it's got a Genesis 2 port on it, make sure it outputs exactly like a Genesis 2, just to save these questions from ever having to be asked. So hopefully that kind of summed things up. If you have any more specific questions, let me know. And welcome. Welcome. Thanks for the support. Glad to see new faces here, or screen names, whatever. Logan remembered that a while back I mentioned that the Mega Drive and Genesis Classic Collection on Steam contained the ROM for those games. If that's the case, do I know where exactly these could be located in the file structure? I completely forgot, but it was something really easy, like find where the collection was installed to, and it's in one of the subfolders. So I think it was the same when I bought Tanglewood, and it was super easy to find where it was. But if anybody happens to remember, could you please post the full file path on, I guess, Windows or Mac or something, if it's even Mac compatible. But if anybody happens to remember, please post the file path, but it should be a fairly easy thing to find. Jose Alvarado is using a Sega Genesis Model 2 using standard composite AV cables on a consumer-grade CRT with an original Sega AC adapter, and the jail bars are really noticeable. Is there a way to fix this, or is this just the way the Model 2 looks? Unfortunately, it might just be how that model looks. I predominantly see Genesis 1s with really bad composite video, and often really bad video in general. However, Genesis is kind of known for having not as good composite video as other consoles. And it is also motherboard specific. Some are way worse than others. If you were using RGB output, I could say, all right, we'll just do a Sega triple bypass and get better audio and video, but that disables composite video. And while we're working on ways to keep it, there's no easy solution for that at the moment. Now, you mentioned replacing the capacitors, and my answer to that is basically, is this a console that you love that you plan on keeping forever? Or is this just something where you have a pile of consoles and you're like, oh, I'd like to play Genesis now and then? Because I don't think a capacitor replacement is going to make a difference. It might. I mean, if the caps are just really bad on the video output, there's certainly a chance that would add to it. But if you plan on keeping the console for a long time anyway, there's no, as long as you mod it right, no harm could be done by replacing them, and they're going to have to be replaced at some point between now and never. So if this is a console you really love and you want to keep, I would replace all the caps in it and cross your fingers and hope that it makes a difference. And if you have the ability to, maybe try swapping it out with a different PSU, or maybe try a different composite video cable. But generally speaking, I think that's kind of where you're going to be stuck with all of this. So if anybody else has any thoughts, I admittedly haven't spent as much time over the years on composite as I probably should have, but I am circling back to that because I know so many people that have basically two setups in one. They have all of their consoles with RGB cables going to a scaler to a flat panel, and that's how they use their system most of the time. But they also have some giant CRT they found somewhere, which they connect with composite video when they want to play light gun games or just have like an original experience. So composite video is starting to get a lot more important to people. And I think that's something I want to spend more time on. So for the short term, I don't have any easy fixes for you, but capacitor replacement is never a bad thing if you plan on keeping a console for a long time. Also, thank you for your kind words, and hello to Costa Rica. I've always wanted to go there, so hopefully I could come hang out one day and have a beer with all my friends out there. Jason Guffey was continuing the conversation about getting a weird color issue when going from RGB to S-Video, and I definitely wanted to talk in a follow-up about this because that should never be a problem. As far as general conversion goes, RGB to composite will have color issues pretty much all the time, but not to S-Video. And I guess the full chain is component video to RGB to S-Video, and that makes sense that would be some cause of weird issues, because when you really shouldn't be converting multiple different formats like that. There's just way too much to go wrong. It would always be better to go from one to the other. So if there was any kind of solution to go from component video to S-Video, or to just use a different cable on that console depending on what setup you're using, that might be a better solution overall. Also, they were hacking their own RGB HV cables using a VGA connector on one end and a 5BNC cable on the other, and they were surprised to find where some of the wires were actually connected to on the VGA side of things, so the D-sub port. And you could find cables that are built wrong, that are built for very specific purposes. That's something I talked to Steve about years and years ago now, where I couldn't figure out why I was getting an issue with one set of cables and not the other, but they looked like the same cable, and it turns out one of them was designed not only for projectors, but for a very specific type of projector. So even though it had VGA on one side and BNC on the other, it wasn't exactly what you would expect. So it's kind of stinks, because it would be nice if you could just click on a link and never have to worry about this, but you might always have to check the pinouts on stuff, or even make your own depending on what kind of weird cable you might make. But that certainly goes back to the conversation of before of, always make sure that your mods output the same on the DINs so you don't have to worry about this stuff. It would be nice if everybody adapted to that so you wouldn't have to worry about things like this. If it's VGA on one side and 5BNC on the other, it should be the same RGB HV cables all connected to the corresponding ground points. So unfortunately, if that's the case, hack up the cable and use it for a different thing, or you might just have to get another cable. Also, some questions about the DVDO VP50. I don't have too much experience with it. I picked one up right when the OSSC was released so that I could then convert the OSSC's output to 1080p that would be compatible with my TV. I really liked it, but I ended up having to sell that one. I got another one recently. It's in storage now, unfortunately. But the one I have now I used for the reasons that I talked about before, deinterlacing, scaling HDMI, and I never had problems with the OSSC. I vaguely remember somebody talking about something on the Shmups forum. It could have been a model. It could have been a firmware revision. There was something. So you might want to check on the Shmups forum in the hardware section, and there should already be a thread about the VP50. And you mentioned trying Super Nintendo. I would just try a different console, any other console, PlayStation, N64, whatever, just to see. But I don't remember personally ever having problems with the OSSC. Also, I guess Jason couldn't find an original remote for the or for the VP50, so they were wondering what kind of universal remotes do I suggest. I am the wrong person to ask that because I hate universal remotes. My entire experience from childhood to now is always the same. I spend the time programming this beautiful remote. Everything's perfect. The remote looks cool. Everything's great. And then I press a button and I move the remote in the wrong angle too quickly. And then half the components go on and the other half don't. So then I have to go dig out other remotes, and it would have been much easier to just grab the same two remotes and use them every day. So just my opinion on that. I'm certainly not discouraging universal remotes, but I am at least explaining why I don't have any info on them, because I can't stand them. And over the years too, I remember getting into a funny argument with my dad about this once, because he bought this beautiful, I think it was a programmable Logitech, and he kept jokingly rubbing it in when I was hanging out, like all night. He'd be like, "Oh, hey, look, I turned the stereo on and only have one remote." And I remember showing up a couple months later, and I was like, "Oh, where's that fancy remote? Did you break it?" And he's like, "No, it stopped working because this didn't work, and I ended up always having to grab this remote anyway." So yeah, just sorry, a little ranty anecdote there, but I'm sure there are some awesome pre-programmed remotes out there, or programmable remotes. But for me, I would probably just look for something like not so much a universal remote that you program to other stuff, but a generic remote that would work with the DVDO. So anybody out there with suggestions, please post. I know that Shmups thread probably still has that as well, but I haven't read through that in a long time, so you might want to just kind of check into that one. Alan Bingham had a pretty interesting question that I'm definitely going to have more questions on than answers, but basically they just picked up a Raspberry Pi 4 and they found that it's really laggy, but they're not talking about input lag. They mean that the video itself is laggy and not very smooth. They actually get much smoother arcade emulation from their hacked Wii. So I think you would just need to describe exactly what you're talking about, because input lag's easy. The time that you press the button to the time the character on screen punches or something, that's input lag. And that's generally what I talk about when I'm talking about lag, the overall experience from button press to motion on screen. But I'm not really sure what you mean about the video itself is laggy. Is there any way you could just describe that differently or something like that? And as far as comparing MAME emulation on a Raspberry Pi to the Wii, I don't think there's a huge difference there at all. And if there was, it would probably swing more in the Pi's favor. But it's an interesting question, and I'm just kind of curious at what exactly the issue might be. But you might want to spend some more time trying different, other than RetroPie, what other solutions are there? Can you try Laka, which is a bit more confusing to use at first, but it's also got a bunch of other options that I always thought were pretty handy. And basically just try different solutions and see what you got. And another explanation of what exactly you mean by the video itself is laggy and not very smooth, because that could mean a whole bunch of things. That could be frame rate, screen tearing. And are you outputting HDMI, or are you going through one of those hats to an RGB or even composite video device? So if you wouldn't mind, kind of getting more info so we could figure this out, I'd be able to answer the question a little better. Well, that's it for this time. Before I go, I want to thank everybody who posted well wishes and congratulations on making it past 150 of these. That was a genuine reaction last week. I was kind of like, all right, what episode are we up to? Whoa, 150. Holy crap. So it was pretty neat. I really do enjoy doing these, and I especially love all the interaction between us. I love talking to everybody, hearing their opinions, hearing everybody's setups, making silly jokes. Sorry if you don't appreciate those. I do mean them with love. I don't ever mean them with harm. But anyway, I just wanted to say thank you again to everybody. I really do appreciate all your support, and I really do enjoy doing these. So thanks again very much, and I'll see you next week.